access to finance and bankability of projects. Now, this is where corporate governance comes in, right? Because when you're looking at the viability of a project, it's not just about the numbers. It's about the systems that companies have in place. Is just a one-man board? Do you use the company as an ATM? Do you have an audit function or a committee on the board that looks at the transactions of the company and at least has one or two independent board members who can give independent advice? So,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say.
I was going to say it's a tricky one in Guyana, particularly because we've had very, very strong and exceedingly successful one-man companies where the quote unquote the boss man, very successful, it built up a multi-billion-dollar empire, and that's because he can make the calls, he can make the decisions on the spot, and so he's built up this successful company by making decisions that are not subject to review. He may say, well, why I need to go to Mary and Jane, who have less experience than I do, to have less access to, have less contacts than I do, before making that decision, which might be very high risk at the time, but because of his experience. The difficulty that happens is that when he is going to move on, there are no systems for transparency, like you say, in his company, because he's the one or she who has been making all those decisions. They don't get documented. And so you got a real investor, you now have a multi-billion US dollar company. Yes, the assets are there, etc. And you have the US or a foreign investor who wants to come pay you whatever, 1.5 billion US dollars for your company. But they ask, let's see how your systems operate. What are the SOPs you have in place? What is the decision-making process? And you don't have that. And that's a major problem for the purchaser, because if it's a public company that's coming to buy that, how is he going to justify to his shareholders that you buy a company where you don't even know, what the processes were for making decisions and how they were documented? Well, what is going to be in the company records? What is going to be in the board resolutions, other than the mandatory resolutions when you're going to borrow if you are going to borrow money from the bank? Of course, you have to have a resolution of the board. Invariably, that person signs it and they borrow X amount of money. But the other decisions that are equally important to the company are not recorded. Shares probably not even issued. A lot of companies in Guyana operate and they haven't even bothered to issue the shares.
Another thing that I found that people are unaware of is the fact that shares actually have to be paid for. You can't just do a resolution saying you're going to issue yourself shares, right? I get a lot of pushback from clients when I say, you got to pay something for the shares. I mean, the par value or the thing value might be $1, right? But you've got to pay something, right? Whether it's $1,000
or
whatever.
A record of the payment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And even if you were going to say you're paying for past service, that past service has to be valued. The Companies Act is very specific on some of those things, right? And people are not willing to even hear that.
We need to create a different or a category of type of company that meets their demands, because clearly there's a demand for people. People think that the past services and I shouldn't have to pay for shares. And some of them are extremely successsul. And I say, look, I've been doing it this way. Why are you giving me grief? Because you're holding me back. I have done, here is a multi-billion-dollar company that I've run successfully this way. Mm-hmm. And is it that perhaps we only look at it through the vehicles that exist in other parts of the world, where maybe we could probably look at the creation of a different type of vehicle? I don't know what it would be like. We're having this discussion now, so I'm thinking about it for time. But clearly, a lot of people in Guyana operate that way. It's not as if this is the random person. A lot of people come to us, and that's how they want to operate. And so, purely from a business perspective, not a legal perspective, you say, well, clearly there's a big demand or a big misconception. How do we fill that? Is there a legal structure that you put there? They have to understand that the less records you have, if you ever want to sell the company, your chances go through the floor. But it's I'm not sure.
Well, I would say this because interacting with the public, right now, I'm always forced to look at some things that I usually wouldn't look at if I was just doing practice alone. And one of the first things that I really interacted with the public about is LLC versus business name registration versus company. Based on my research, an LLC is not actually what we would consider a limited liability company like in Ghana. It's more like what you would get with a LLP, a limited liability partnership,
Yep.
right? You have something called a owner's draw, but it has some limited liability, but it doesn't have that kind of strict structure. Obviously, you still have to document everything, not in the same way that you would have to document stuff with a company, and that is its own headache trying to explain that to people in Guyana. Again, it really comes back to the access to finance and bankability because due diligence, every bank looks at risk very stringently in Guyana. They want to see the minutes of the meeting, your
Well,
P&L, your all these
but
different financial statements.
doesn't that depend on the bank's customer, who the bank's customer is? It's not a uniform approach. So if Mr. Head of a very successful family business says, "Hey, we need to borrow $40 million US. This is the project." Yeah. Well, you're going to give us the necessities for us to pass the compliance stage, but taking a charge over cash flow of a company, not particularly popular, but that's a means in which you can raise money. Shares, lodging shares and security. We still have provisions that say, that you can't raise capital on it. So our market for access to finance is pretty rudimentary, and we need to start getting a lot of those new instruments in. So that's part of the whole New Companies Act that you've been talking about.
Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to raise, so like invoice factoring, this was only brought into being because of the number of lucrative foreign contracts, with the IOCs and their subcontractors is being lost because the companies that can provide the services don't have the access to finance, right? And it took almost a decade for banks to realize that there's money to be made here doing invoice factoring.
Indeed.
And
Go ahead.
anecdotally, you'll hear stories about the common man having a lot of problems with AML compliance at banks and being able to get loans. You'll also hear anecdotally, the big boys in society don't have that problem. When there was the issue with the assistant police commissioner, Calvin Brutus, and there were many exposés that came out in the newspapers about deposits made at the bank by either him or a company that he is associated with. The figures are staggering. One wonders how things like that happen, but it comes back to our society. I think we've spoken about the personality, but it is also kind of the connections that you have. The common man will always have issues that more well-connected people in society. But again, there's no real data on that type of thing. It's mostly you'll hear through anecdotes.
Is it that it's the connections only, or is it that we have 8 enforcement institutions?
Hey, so please accept our apologies. We had some technical difficulties and we lost the last few minutes of the show. Now, Nigel will be back for us to continue our discussion. When he is back, we will be continuing our discussion on joint venture companies and what we think would help raise the bar with corporate affairs and transactions again. And specifically, we're going to be looking at some changes that we would advocate to see in a new Companies Act.